Sometime after dark on the 7th of February 1969, a telephone rang at the British Rail Control Office in Huddersfield. On the other end, a voice fighting panic. 50 students were trapped in Marsden, not in a collapsed building, not in a flooding river, they were simply stuck. The roads into the village had vanished under snow, every bus route sealed, every car useless. The Colne Valley, one of the deepest cuts through the South Pennines, had become a white prison. The controller studied his options. He had one. A 2-car diesel multiple unit sitting idle at Huddersfield Station, 7 miles of track threading through the valley floor. And at the far end, the standage tunnels, 3 miles of darkness bored straight through the Pennine backbone. If the rails were still clear, he could punch a train through to Marsden and bring those students out. Road transport had completely failed. The railway was the only way. This is the story of a night when 50 young lives depended on 2 diesel rail cars and a stretch of track that had been fighting the Pennine weather since 1849. Marsden sits at the western edge of West Yorkshire, 7 miles from Huddersfield, at the confluence of the River Colne and Wessenden Brook. The village clings to the valley floor at roughly 650 feet above sea level. On 3 sides, open moorland rises sharply. Saddleworth Moor to the north, the Marsden and Meltham Moors to the south and west. The Peak District boundary begins just beyond the reservoirs. In good weather, it is beautiful. Wild, remote, but accessible. In a Pennine blizzard, it becomes something else entirely. The moorland funnels wind down into the valley. Snow accumulates with terrifying speed, and the single road east, the A62 through the Colne Valley toward Huddersfield, runs exposed along the valley bottom where drifts build fastest. When that road closes, Marsden is cut off. The only reliable route that remains is the one carved by the London and North Western Railway, over a century earlier, the Huddersfield line, running through the village station before plunging into the Standage Tunnel toward Manchester. February 1969 brought one of the most punishing sequences of winter storms to hit Britain in the post-war era. Not since the brutal winter of 1962-63, the big freeze that had paralysed the nation for 3 months, had the country faced such sustained and vicious cold. The month arrived bitter. By the first week, temperatures across northern England had dropped well below freezing and stayed there. The ground hardened like iron. Pipes froze in terraced houses across the Pennine valleys. Farmers on the high moorland above Marsden began bringing sheep down to lower ground, recognising the signs that old hands in the Colne Valley knew all too well. Something bad was building over the hills. Then the snow came. The blizzard that struck on the 7th of February hit the Pennines with particular ferocity. Easterly winds drove snow horizontally across the exposed moorland. Within hours, drifts of 8 to 10 feet blocked roads across the high ground. The A62 through the Colne Valley became impassable. Council gritting lorries, already struggling with the volume, simply could not keep pace. By early evening, the road network around Marsden had effectively ceased to exist. Across the broader Pennine region, the railway was under siege. On the Woodhead route, the Manchester to Sheffield electric services encountered heavy delays, with diesel locomotives hastily substituting for failed electric workings. East of the Pennines, timetables collapsed. Services were amended, rerouted, or cancelled outright. The 2150 York to Aberystwyth Mail, an 8-coach formation, found itself surprisingly hauled by locomotive 5150, pressed into local service between Leeds and Huddersfield to fill gaps in the decimated timetable. But it was on the Huddersfield line, the route through Marsden and the Standage tunnels, that the storm created its most human crisis. The 50 students stranded in Marsden that night were not mountaineers caught on exposed ridges. They were not hikers who had ignored weather warnings. They were young people who had simply been in the wrong place when the weather turned murderous. The roads they would normally have taken home had disappeared under snow. Bus services had been cancelled. Private cars were buried or stuck. The telephone calls to parents, to schools, to transport authorities all returned the same answer. No one could get through by road. The Colne Valley had become a trap. British Rail's response was immediate and practical. A 2-car diesel multiple unit was the obvious choice. These workhorses of the 1960s railway, the first generation of rail cars that had replaced steam on branch lines and local services across the country, were designed precisely for this kind of operation. Light enough to run on the branch service pattern, typically weighing around 55 to 60 tons for a two-car set. Powerful enough to handle the gradient from Huddersfield up to Marsden, a steady climb through the narrowing Colne Valley, and crucially, available. The diesel multiple unit fleet, despite its well-documented struggles with cold weather, frozen radiators, cracked engine blocks, and failed heating systems during the 1969 blizzards, had one critical advantage over road vehicles. It ran on steel rails that sat below the drifting snowline for most of the valley route, sheltered in the cutting that the original Victorian navvies had carved through the valley floor. Rails that were, if not entirely clear, at least navigable. The decision was made. Dispatch the unit to Marsden, load the students, bring them back to Huddersfield. It sounds simple. It was not. The Huddersfield line climbed steadily westward from the town centre, following the River Colne through a narrowing valley. The stations tick past in quick succession: Lockwood, Berrybrow, Honley, Brockholes, Stocksmoor, Shepley. Then the gradient eases slightly before the final push to Marsden and the tunnel mouth. In normal conditions, the journey takes roughly 15 minutes. On the night of the 7th of February 1969, nothing was normal. The track itself was the lifeline. British Rail's permanent way gangs had been working through the day to keep the Huddersfield line open. Point heaters glowed orange in the darkness at junctions and crossings. Signalmen at the mechanical signal boxes along the route maintained communication by telephone, the old-fashioned block system that had kept trains safe for a century, proving more reliable than the modern equipment that was failing elsewhere on the network. At Diggle, on the Manchester side of the Standage tunnels, the semaphore signalling had frozen solid. Hand signalling was being used to control traffic. The 17:05 service from Liverpool had needed 3 attempts to break through snowdrifts near the tunnel approaches. But on the Yorkshire side, the route to Marsden remained passable. Just. The two-car diesel unit left Huddersfield and pushed west into the storm, headlights cutting through driving snow, the driver watching the rail ahead for drifts that might have formed since the last passage. The windscreen wipers fighting a losing battle against the horizontal snow. Inside the carriages, the heating system doing what it could against temperatures that had plummeted below -5. Marsden Station sits on 3 platforms, with the main access from a road overbridge crossing the line to the west. The station opened in 1849, the same year the first Standage railway tunnel was completed. For 120 years, it had served this valley community through every kind of weather the Pennines could produce. Tonight, it would serve as an evacuation point. The students were gathered and brought to the platform. 50 young people, cold, anxious, some frightened. They had watched the snow bury their village throughout the afternoon and evening. They had seen the roads disappear. Some had tried to walk and turned back, the wind-driven snow stinging their faces, the drifts already knee-deep on the valley road. Others had waited by telephones, listening to the same message repeated. No buses running, no taxis available, nothing moving on the roads. Now, standing on the platform of a small Pennine station in a howling blizzard, stamping their feet against the cold, pulling coats tighter against the wind that howled down the valley, they were boarding a train that represented their only way home. The platform lights cast yellow pools on the snow-covered concrete. The diesel engines of the multiple unit idled, their exhaust rising and vanishing into the darkness. The two-car unit had seating for approximately 120 passengers in its standard configuration. 50 students, plus any railway staff and accompanying adults, would fill it comfortably, but not overwhelm it. The driver made his checks, the guard confirmed the loading, and the unit pulled away from Marsden, heading east, back down the valley toward Huddersfield. The return journey traced the same route through the same storm, but now the train carried its cargo. 50 students who, without the railway, would have spent the night stranded in a snowbound village with no certainty of when the roads might reopen. As it turned out, the blizzards of February 1969 continued for days. Yet February the 14th and 15th brought further substantial snowfall across the northwest. February the 20th produced conditions even worse than the 7th, with trains stuck in drifts on the Hope Valley route and diesel multiple units trapped at the west end of Cowburn Tunnel. The rescue at Marsden was not an isolated incident. It was part of a broader pattern that emerged throughout the 1969 winter. When roads failed, the railway stepped in. When modern systems broke down, older methods proved their worth. The block signalling system, designed in the Victorian era, kept working when electronic systems froze. The steel rails, laid on ballast and maintained by gangs of men with shovels and picks, remained passable when tarmac roads disappeared under drifts. On the Penistone branch, conditions became so desperate that Class 40 locomotive number 399 was assigned to pilot all diesel multiple unit services between Clayton West Junction and Penistone, a mainline express locomotive nursemaiding lightweight rail cars through snowdrifts. At Skelmanthorpe, locomotive 6922 could not move its 27 loaded coal wagons despite splitting the train. The crew abandoned the wagons and set off for Healy Mills, only for the locomotive to fail completely near Brockholes. 2 local multiple units eventually pushed the dead engine into Huddersfield. That night, Healy Mills Class 37s hauled snowplows over the Penistone line 4 times to keep it open. This was the reality of railway operation during the February 1969 blizzards. Every line kept open was kept open by brute effort. Every service that ran was a small victory against the weather, and every rescue, like the one at Marsden, was a reminder that the Victorian engineers who drove railways through the most inhospitable terrain in England had built something more resilient than anyone in 1969 might have expected. The standage tunnels themselves, 3 miles of bore through solid gritstone and shale, provided something no road could offer: protection. A train inside standage was shielded from wind, from drifting snow, from the worst the Pennines could throw at it. The tunnel entrances might accumulate snow, the approaches might drift, but the tunnel itself was impervious to the storm above. The London and North Western Railway had opened the first tunnel in 1848. The second followed in 1871. The third, a double-track bore still in use today, was completed in 1894. Together they represented over 120 years of engineering investment in keeping this trans-Pennine route open. On the night of the 7th of February 1969, that investment paid its dividend in human terms: 50 students, safe. The broader lessons of that winter were not lost on transport planners, though they were slow to act on them. The 1969 blizzards demonstrated once again that railways possessed an inherent resilience that road transport simply could not match. Rail sat lower than the surrounding terrain in cuttings, naturally protected from the worst drifting. Tunnels eliminated exposure entirely. The concentrated nature of rail infrastructure meant that keeping one route open required clearing one narrow corridor, not an entire road network, and the power-to-weight ratio of even a modest diesel multiple unit could push through snow conditions that would stop any bus or car. But 1969 was also the era of the beaching cuts. Branch lines across Britain were being closed at an alarming rate. Rural stations were being shuttered and boarded up. The very network that provided emergency resilience during extreme weather was being systematically dismantled in the name of efficiency and cost savings. Just the previous August, in 1968, the alternative route through Devon via Oakhampton had been closed, and when the blizzard struck the West Country in February 1969, Rural railway authorities had to send snowplows along the abandoned route to reopen it as an emergency diversion, only to discover that all signalling and telephone equipment had already been stripped out. The Marsden rescue happened on a line that survived the cuts, the Huddersfield to Manchester route being too strategically important to close. But many of the communities that lost their railway connections in the 1960s discovered, during winters like 1969, exactly what they had lost. A 2-car diesel multiple unit, 7 miles of track, 50 students brought to safety. No one called it heroic at the time. It was simply what the railway did. It ran. When nothing else could move, when the roads were buried and the buses were cancelled and the cars were stuck, the railway ran. A controller made a phone call. A driver took his train into the storm. A guard loaded 50 cold and frightened students into warm carriages, and the 2-car unit rattled back down the Colne Valley to Huddersfield, its headlights cutting 2 pale beams through the darkness and the driving snow. The students went home that night. The blizzard continued. The railway kept running. There were no newspaper headlines the next morning about the Marsden rescue. No television crews had been there to film the students boarding the train. No politicians visited to shake hands and pose for photographs. It was a small event in a large storm, one entry in the operational log of a railway district, fighting to keep its services moving through the worst winter weather in years. The controller who made the decision, the driver who took the unit into the blizzard, the guard who loaded those 50 students onto the train, none of their names were recorded for history. But the students remembered. 50 young people who learned, on one freezing February night in 1969, that when everything modern fails, when the roads are blocked and the buses are cancelled and the telephones just ring and ring, there is still a railway, still 2 steel rails running through the valley, still a train that will come. Marsden Station still stands today. The Huddersfield line still runs through the Colne Valley and into the Standage Tunnel. Trans-Pennine Express services call hourly. The village still sits at the mercy of Pennine weather, still surrounded on 3 sides by open moorland, still accessible from the east along the valley floor. And when the snow comes, as it always does in the high Pennines, the railway is still there. Steel rails on stone ballast. The same route, the same tunnels, the same stubborn refusal to surrender to the weather that has defined this line since 1849. Some things, it turns out, are built to last.